help me understand the Russian mindset a bit better. I know that almost immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, there was this big debate among the Bolsheviks, right at the top, between Lenin and Stalin, as to what extent is this a Russian revolution, or to what extent is it a Soviet revolution? And the argument that won, as I understand it, is that we can't use the word Russia. We've got to use the word Soviet. We've got to make sure that local nationalisms are properly accommodated by this sort of neutralizing commitment to being Soviet. And so you had decades and decades and decades where this very lively Russian patriotic sentiment was effectively forcibly suppressed with something like the modern liberal doctrine of multiculturalism. And that is to say, we can't prioritize
we will do that, but we can come back to it. Sorry.
So, and maybe this is purely speculative. What I'm trying
Everything
to understand...
Everything else you're saying is 100%.
Is one way of understanding the resurgence of Russian nationalism is if it had been sort of oddly suppressed in the Soviet era, and now it's sort of come back to the fore, and there's a sense that Russia is not just any old country. The Americans mock it for just being a petrol station with some nuclear weapons. And, yes, economically, it's not huge. But it's more, they feel as if they're more than a country. They're a civilisational state. And we took on Napoleon, they think. We took on, and we beat him, and we took on Hitler, and we beat them, and we liberated Europe. And we're not being honoured somehow. And we're not allowed to have a sense of spirit and confidence in what it is to be Russian. Or is it just a sort of personal political cult around Putin that he's cynically exploiting nationalist sentiment to achieve his own ends?
I will confess, I don't know that the nationalist angle is what I would reach for here. That's not my perspective. I don't hear there is, of course, a fringe of those people in Russia who are Russian nationalists, but actually Russia has retained its imperial worldview and internal perspective, in the sense that an Armenian would not say that they're ethnically Russian. We have two words for this. As you know, I got into a lot of trouble trying to explain the difference between Englishness and Britishness to British and English people, which just makes me laugh every time. But in Russian, we have two words, Ruski, which means an ethnic Russian, and Россиянин, which means a Russian citizen. And it's effectively the difference between saying I'm ethnically English and I'm British, which is what I am, right? So I don't think this is a Ruski nationalism issue. I think it's an issue of, look, let's be honest, Russia was defeated in the Cold War and humiliated. I don't necessarily agree with this view that the Americans came over and sort of rubbed their foot in Russia's face, exactly. But losing a war is very painful. It's very unpleasant. And unless you have a kind of a rational explanation for why it's your own responsibility, it's very, very tempting to then blame the other people for having defeated you.
I know, for example, that British diplomats at the end of the 80s and the 90s would talk about the Cold War having come to an end. American diplomats preferred the rhetoric of "we won."
Yes, and that's the difference between the British and American psyche, among other things, I would say. But my point is that, this narrative of the Americans abusing Russia in the 90s, I'm sure there were people who were doing that. But at the same time, I remember as a boy in Russia in the early 90s being given out cans of Spam and broiler American chicken legs because there was also so-called humanitarian aid. And I think actually in some ways that was much more insulting to Russians, the sort of like hand-me-downs and all of this. So the defeat that they experienced and the experiment with democracy, which was so painful and unpleasant for most people, is what then produces the correction of Putin, who comes in and he nationalizes the corruption other than allowing it, nationalizes the crime, nationalizes the oligarchy. So oligarchs are no longer the people who manage to steal as much as possible, but are appointed. An oligarch is now an appointed position within the Russian government. And so that corruption everything's been brought under control. Some of the petrol station money has been pumped into making the big cities nice, building infrastructure, etc., etc. So the Putin personal project really benefited from the rise in oil prices and the ability to spend some of that money on the populace. But I don't think this is about Russian nationalism. This is about geopolitics, as far as I can tell. And part of the reason I sense this is, in the conversation you mentioned with my dad, his job used to be in the Russian government. It's one of the reasons we disagree so strongly, to effectively, in the early 90s, attempt to bring back the countries which were fleeing the Russian orbit as much as they possibly could. This is always going to be Russia's natural inclination. Most of Russia's industrial and intellectual and other assets, most of those assets are contained in its westernmost 20%. The rest of the country is pretty much a backwater with some natural resources. And that area of Russia is extraordinarily vulnerable to invasion from the West.
This is effectively the corridor from St. Petersburg down through Moscow to the Black Sea.
Yes. And so if you are so vulnerable in that area, you're naturally going to want to extend the cushion westwards as much as possible. And so the reason that, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, and other countries in Eastern Europe are actually on a per capita basis providing the highest amount of aid to Ukraine of anyone, including America. The reason they're doing that is they know history. They know what happens when Russia is powerful.
And even though they are in NATO and, the risks of triggering Article 5 are there in a way that they weren't with the Ukraine, still they feel threatened, and plausibly so.
Yes, and also the question becomes, I don't remember if you remember that great scene from, I think it's Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, where the civil servant is essentially attempting to find out at which point the minister would be prepared to go to nuclear war. And he gives all sort of scenarios about, there is there's an uprising in Poland that is such and such. Is after everything we've seen, are we confident that, a senile President Biden, for example, is likely to go to nuclear war over a small incursion into Estonia? Are we certain about this? Are Estonians certain about this, more importantly? I think this is throwing a lot of these types of questions into the conversation. So I think it would be a very unwise president of Poland or Latvia or Estonia or Lithuania who says, we're NATO, therefore everything's fine. They certainly do not feel that way. And I think for historical reasons. So all I'm trying to say is I think that in addition to the Putin personal project, which I'm sure is a big part of this, which is, how do you want to be remembered? Tsar Vladimir, because that's what he is at this point. He's been in power for 26 years at this point, right? This isn't a democracy in any sense at all. How are you going to be remembered? Well, if you're remembered as someone who put Russia back on the map, that's a wonderful legacy to be left with. But also, Russia has very important strategic interest in expansion westwards, and it will seek to do that at every opportunity when it's afforded to, which is why I believe in having a very strong deterrent, which is why I believed it was important to support Ukraine to prevent any more of this happening.